Boardroom Bound, episode 110, Why Marrying Strategy with Great Execution is a Staple for Boardroom Success, with Shannon Gordon.
You're right. You're absolutely spot on. We certainly have seen more of a trend. I think for a while it has been a trend to look at somebody with maybe a classic kind of CHRO type background, but that can take a lot of different flavors.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're talking with Shannon Gordon, and she is CEO of theBoardlist. And theBoardlist is a talent marketplace that connects highly qualified women leaders with opportunities to serve on private and public company boards. And they're also involved with the Board Challenge, which is a dedicated movement to get underrepresented communities, specifically the Black individuals, onto boards, male or female. And I want to really share what these organizations are doing, helping moving the dial and doing it in a great way. They've been very successful at it. And there's a lot that we can all learn today about how the boardroom could be changing. I'm excited that we have a new sponsor of the show, Patina Solutions. Patina has asked me to host a webinar on February 9th. This event will be invaluable for most everyone in my audience since it's all about how to secure your first board seat. I'm guessing you're listening to this podcast because you want to join a board, but perhaps you're stymied by the process. If that's you, then join me as I host a webinar on February 9th. Participants will take away tools and gain expertise to help secure their first public or private company board seat. You can find more details in today's show notes or learn more at bit.ly/board seat. That's bit.ly/board seat. Now let's jump into today's episode. Shannon Gordon, welcome to the Boardroom Bound Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you on the show today because what you guys are doing is something that I've been hearing about in private conversations, in the networking discussions that I've had. It's an organization that's really growing in terms of its notoriety, and clearly what you've done recently that we'll talk about, the Board Challenge, is starting to make positive waves, if I describe it that way. So excited to have you guys on the show today. But let's start at the beginning, and maybe you can tell us the story about how the Boardlist began and what you guys are doing and the progress that you're making.
Absolutely, happy to. Well, the Boardlist did not begin with me, so I'll tell you by proxy how it started. Our founder is Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, who is most recently the CEO of StubHub, the ticketing company, which has recently been sold. But prior to that, Sukhinder's background is an impressive one. She has served on many public company boards as well as private company boards. She's founded several of her own companies and co-founded as well. And also has been a senior executive at companies like Google and Amazon, and served as CEO of several others. So an impressive background. In her conversations, 3-4 years ago now, this was back in 2016, she was very frustrated by the conversation that was going on in Silicon Valley. This conversation that, in order to change the culture of tech companies and of Silicon Valley generally away from quote-unquote a bro culture, we would have to wait for the next generation of women to come up through STEM because simply there weren't enough. It was, the age-old pipeline problem issue that kept coming up. And she was frustrated by that because she said, one way to change the culture of these companies overnight is to put a woman on the board of every Series B company and beyond. Guaranteed. And by the way, these women don't need to have a STEM background because there are plenty of leaders in Silicon Valley that don't have a STEM background and they're incredibly successful. And the pipeline is strong to do that. She didn't see any movement in that direction, and so as is often the case with Sukhinder, she took matters into her own hands and reached out to her network of board directors and asked them to recommend women from their networks that should be serving on boards but weren't yet, or were highly qualified to do so but just hadn't had the opportunity. and almost overnight had a list of, I think, 600, and then that turned into 1,000, and today we're at 16,000. So I think sufficiently debunks the pipeline myth, but that's how we got started. And I think for Sukhinder, she came to Silicon Valley with a banking and media background, and was a very successful business development professional, and had a style that was, maybe a little bit aggressive, but really going after gold and making deals happen, and paving a very successful path in Silicon Valley. And there were a couple of instances early on in her career where she almost stepped out because she likes to tell the story of someone saying that the secretaries at a particular company were scared of her. I think this was her first job in Silicon Valley, and she was so confused by that. Why would they be scared of me? I'm behaving like all of my male colleagues. And so, I think she's always had a really strong passion for this topic, and really wants to see other women be successful in Silicon Valley and beyond. So those are the origins of the board list. Now, certainly we're at a different place than all of that, but still have those grains of our beginnings as part of our core.
And one thing I'd like to touch upon here, we've never covered in a show this way when you think about Silicon Valley, right? I think everyone has seen the world today, how it seems like the big tech companies are dominating. There are a couple names we all recognize, but Silicon Valley is known as a place where things can change. Different cultures can happen. Amazing opportunities for organizations can grow versus, say, maybe some of the more stodgy businesses, perhaps back on the East Coast. Is this part of the philosophy that we can see change happen more rapidly here because what happens in Silicon Valley will grow to other places in the world?
I think so. I think that it is a place of innovation, and when somebody is looking to make change, this is a place they often come. Interestingly, though, I do find it's a place that is sometimes difficult to change. We've had a lot of challenge. If you think about the core kind of industry of Silicon Valley, right, venture-backed tech companies. Mm-hmm. Those, from an innovation standpoint, obviously are paving the way and making tremendous change around the world by the technology innovation that they're driving. However, the culture has been relatively slow to change, and that, it's due to a number of factors. I think there has just simply not been a lot of diversity, particularly in the investment community, which has perpetuated, obviously, those that sit on boards are oftentimes those who are investing in the company, and so we have significant homogeneity on the boards of these companies. There's also a pattern of investment, right? Up until very recently, there was kind of a stereotypical founder that received the vast majority of capital in Silicon Valley, and that individual was typically male, often a white man with a particular background in engineering, et cetera. And so that, those are the origins of what has made Silicon Valley, such an innovative place, but unfortunately has been a pattern that we've had a hard time breaking out of. And I still find that it's a space where we don't actually see a lot of innovation and pace of change here.
And so clearly you guys began in the tech industry, but you've now expanded across many verticals. And actually, as the organization has grown and developed, while the focus was initially on just getting women representation on the board, you've now expressed all underrepresented minorities, sort of regardless of gender, are people that we want to be advancing the cause of. Is that right?
Exactly. We started in Silicon Valley. Those are our origins. Today, a little less than a quarter of our searches and our candidate base are actually based here in Silicon Valley and in the tech industry. So we cover all industries. Our candidates cover the gamut of functional areas of expertise. And then as of this summer, we also opened the board list, as you said, to underrepresented individuals. And so we now have men on the platform as well. Sukhinder and I have long talked about this as an important change that we've always wanted to make, being a platform that stands for diversity. We started with gender because there was a clear and urgent need there. But looking at the issue in the last year or so, it's clear progress is being made within the realm of gender diversity. We're nowhere near done, but certainly progress has been made. But other groups were not brought along with that progress, and that did not feel right to us, and we wanted to change our focus to have a broader tent.
Well, you've seen that from the the California focus that you initially had when they first changed the law and allowed women on. Not that all boards have added them yet, but that has been clearly growing, developing as the financial penalties change and time takes place. But the vast majority were white women being added. So it went from, say, maybe pale, male, and stale to still pale, right, for the most part. It's fascinating to think that there are, about 40% of California is Latino, but the board members are about 0.4% Latino. So clearly more can be done in lots of different ways.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And what's interesting is that we see a lot of that reporting done and a lot of the statistics presented on public companies. So clearly the population statistics are obvious, but the way that population is represented in the boardroom oftentimes gets reflected from a public company standpoint because that is very knowable data. It's published, it's available. I think what we have found really interesting is how those numbers change when you start looking at private companies. So the vast, there is an incredible number of private companies out there that represent a huge portion of the workforce, but very little data is available on the diversity of those boards. And when we have done kind of small sample sets and looked at private companies, we actually find that they're far less diverse than public companies. So in some ways, I feel that the progress has been slightly overstated.
That's fascinating. So I'm a big fan of 22 women on boards involved in their activities, and they've tracked their progress versus different indices. And now the Russell 3000 has crossed the mark, so we are seeing it move in the right direction. But I think the conversation, to your point, might be moving more towards from a representation of whether it's 20, 30%, whatever an organization advocates, maybe up to parity. But again, not just gender. So those activities. Well, tell us a little bit about your talent marketplace and how it actually works, because clearly there are opportunities for individuals to sign up, but you also have organizations joining. How does it actually work in terms of the matching process?
Absolutely. So you're correct. It is a talent marketplace. We have candidates on the board list that about 16,000 members at this point. Those candidates have all been recommended by either a board director in their network or by one of our esteemed partners. So we partner with a number of organizations that are working in this space to advance either women in the boardroom or racial diversity in the boardroom, or generally have a membership that is highly qualified to serve on boards. So we accept recommendations from those organizations as well. So all of the candidates on the platform may not have board experience. And in fact, we're particularly excited when we do identify people who have not yet served on boards, because that way we're able to serve out this emerging talent. But that has been, validated as highly credible and is qualified to serve on boards per the board director recommendation. So that's our candidate base. And as I said, they span industry, span functional area of expertise. And on the company side, we've actually had about 1,800 companies come to the platform and look for talent. And those, again, range across industry, but they also are both public and private. About a quarter of our searches are public company searches. Sometimes we'll do that in conjunction with a search firm, and they're just looking for a supplementary diverse list of candidates. And then we have many private companies. Interestingly, we find private companies are really excited to find a tool like the board list because, frankly, there are not very many tools out there to actually find diverse talent. Particularly, if you don't engage a search firm, you're really stuck with either LinkedIn or your professional network, which we know that is actually part of the problem and what drives the lack of diversity, given that networks tend to be pretty homogeneous. Mm-hmm. So we're delighted to serve those companies, and we have companies that come to us, as early as Series A and just, under 10 million in revenue, all the way up to companies starting to get ready for an IPO. And
so one of the things that I would love to hear your thoughts on are when a candidate is perhaps thinking, okay, at some point down the line, I want to join a board. Maybe they're a fast rising star. They're going to have a lot of the right experience, but it might not be today. These are the emerging talent that you're talking about. Are these the sort of people that already need to come with a clear plan for networking and their brand and all the right documentation behind it? Or at what point do they come in their journey? Maybe any thoughts like that for our audience listening to think who would be the people that you'd want to be seeing come on as potential candidates?
Well, interestingly, I would classify emerging talent as simply somebody who hasn't served on a board before, but they can fall in a couple of different buckets. We have quote-unquote emerging talent that is imminently ready to serve and probably should have been serving on boards for years, but maybe has just had their heads down in their operating role, and it hasn't been a priority for them. Maybe their network has never encouraged them or mentioned that this would be a great way for them to give back to other companies, extend their own learning, and benefit, frankly, the companies that they're working for today. So that's one set of what I would call emerging talent. But those that maybe not quite ready are generally people that are reaching, a senior level in their career. They've had a number of experiences, particularly in areas that boards are oftentimes grappling with. So anyone that's been through, a business transaction like M&A or an IPO, oftentimes highly sought after. An area of functional expertise that is highly valued in the boardroom. Let's say they're, a senior finance executive, or they have expertise in a particular emerging technology area. They are expert in digital transformation. You can imagine, so many boards are talking about that for their companies. So an area of expertise that is particularly relevant for the boardroom also is often a flag that somebody might want to start thinking about board opportunities. And then lastly, I would say there's, more and more we're seeing a bucket of emerging talent that has kind of a non-traditional skill set. So perhaps not the, CFO or, CEO background, traditional P&L management, but perhaps somebody who is really in touch with the millennial customer set, or a strong influencer, right? And is bringing a perspective that is absolutely critical to the boardroom, having a view into, the customer base that they serve. That is also a profile that is increasingly becoming important for boardrooms, and more what we're seeing in our emerging talent set.
I was going to ask that because, let's say during COVID, for example, we're seeing more conversation in the boardroom that, say, a chief HR officer, people with their finger on a pulse of talent development, how the organization should grow and change. Maybe there's more recognition that that sort of role would be very valuable in the board space. Clearly, there have been shifts over time to, say, cybersecurity and other specialist skill sets as well, depending on the organization, whether they write knowledge of marketing and social and things like that, it would have a space in the organization. And when you're talking about sort of emerging talent, sometimes these might be the younger people that we are seeing people even on their late 30s getting put on major boards because they have exactly the right skill set and perhaps also better speak to what a customer thinks their board should be looking like is a good part of it as well. Exactly. I would love if you give us some thoughts about that. I don't know how your collective database covers some of those different angles.
You're right. You're absolutely spot on. We certainly have seen more of a trend. I think for a while it has been a trend to look at somebody with maybe a classic kind of CHRO type background, but that can take a lot of different flavors. It can either be, we want the compensation expertise, we want the ability to coach perhaps the first time or younger CEO. So that skill set has been long sought after. I think now for different reasons, right? I mean, we're certainly in a war for talent, and so the ability to structure and build culture that attracts a really strong workforce is a skill set that is often important, or a perspective to have in the boardroom. But I think, especially in COVID, as the workforce has changed so much, will continue to change. And I certainly don't think that we have any answers about how the workforce will be structured going forward. That skill set, I think, even more attractive. As boards have open roles, that is certainly a request that we're getting more and more frequently. But beyond that, I mean, as you say, I think having this perspective, frankly, it's a blind spot for boards if they have, when we think about the definition of diversity, we can talk about gender diversity, we talk about racial diversity, talk about even diversity just of perspective functionally, and sort of different types of expertise represented in the boardroom, all important. But one I think boards oftentimes forget is age diversity. And I don't think it's just age diversity for the sake of diversity. There's certainly, as is true for all forms of diversity, there's a very specific purpose for having these individuals represented in the boardroom, and that is that when you think about the purchasing power of women and the way that that's changed over the last few decades, the emergence of this millennial set and that purchasing power, the sort of transformation of the economy based on the way millennials are interacting and adopting product and technology. Not having that perspective in the boardroom is actually an area of significant risk for a number of boards. And so, oftentimes there's hesitancy to, quote unquote, give up a seat to somebody that doesn't have very strong P&L experience or maybe, hasn't developed these traditional governance skills. But I think really sophisticated boards that are being thoughtful about the important strategic issues that will be facing them over the next couple of years are thinking, gosh, maybe I don't need the duplication of having four former or sitting CEOs or CFOs in the room. I actually need one or two of those, and I need to complement that skill set with, a very strong representation of my customer base from a racial standpoint, from a gender standpoint, from an age standpoint.
And it's interesting when we look at public company annual reports and you get a photo of the board of directors, you can very clearly look at it in 1 second and realize, okay, what sort of quote unquote diversity can we visibly see from the outside? And gender was a good and easy way to start that conversation. There was a recognition of it. And I remember thinking back to my prior role at JP Morgan, there were business resource groups, they were called. There's one for females, there was one for the Black community, the Latino community, and others. And it was almost like the organization was so big it had to push one at a time. And first it was pushing the female approach first, and because there's a massive, let's say, structure that has to be built behind it of all the mentorships and other opportunities. All of these were good and important things, but you can only do so much at a time. Clearly, the board list somewhat similarly was starting with the females, but I would love to talk about the board challenge that you guys are a big part of now.
Sure.
And we are seeing, especially with, say, the movement of Black Lives Matter, more recognition. Again, another good thing that we should be seeing in the boardroom is having more of African-American descent perspective represented. Perhaps you can tell us about the board challenge and how that's going.
Absolutely. So over the summer, we got a call from Brad Gerstner at Altimeter Capital, and he had this thought, idea, concern, reacting to what was happening in the streets of America and the broader social justice movement, particularly within the African American community and those that support it. A point of view that, one, what is it that we can do in the business community that would be supportive to that movement? How do we advance the cause within sort of our own realm? And the second was a concern that too many times these things happen and then they dissipate without impact. And we didn't want to see that happen with this particular movement. And so we talked about ways that we could be supportive and came up with the idea of the board challenge. The board challenge is an ask to any company of any size in any industry to add a Black director to their board within the next 12 months if they don't currently have one. It's as simple as that. And we wanted to keep it very simple with no, additional frills or anything. Just commit to doing it. If you don't have a Black director, add one. If you do, we've asked a number of companies that already have a Black director to continue thinking about what true and full representation means on their board, rather than dictating, it's important to add another Black director, to be really thoughtful, again, about, the customers they serve, the employee base, and the communities that they live in. What does true and full representation look like for that board? So we've had a number of companies join us as what we're calling charter partners that have lent their voice and support, are recruiting other companies to take the pledge, that are also committed to this longer-term goal of true and full representation. So we launched at the beginning of September with 44 original companies that had joined us, and we are now up to about 60 that have taken the board challenge. So very exciting to see that movement and commitment. And as I said, this is in no means an answer to the much broader and more important challenge that we have in our society today, but it was the thing that we could do to make a difference. So we're very excited to have seen the movement. The engagement from leaders has been fantastic. We've already had 4 directors placed as a result of the board challenge, so that's been exciting to see as well.
Well, kudos to you guys for doing something that is helpful and is important. And I wonder if you have thoughts, not only from this, but sort of the way the board list started. It's interesting for me. I am blessed to have the great conversations on this podcast about the boardroom. How do we get to more diversity of thought in there from lots of different perspectives? But sometimes the conversation stops there as opposed to also extending down below it into the C-suite, which can still in many ways sometimes be stale, male, and pale. There might be diversity, but you think about, we talked about who has the P&L roles before. Those might generally be pale, male, and stale, as opposed to if there's diversity overall within the C-suite. Do you feel like the great work that you guys are doing in the boardroom is moving itself down to the level below that?
Yes and no. I think, philosophically, the idea was with the board list was to start at the top. And when you have a boardroom that is diverse and representing the voices, perspective, gender, race, et cetera, of the employees and the communities that you're serving, that things start to change from there, right? So you start to see more diverse C-suite, you start to see more diverse employee base, you start to see more sort of friendly policies for the company for a greater diversity in the workforce. And that is true. That said, I don't think anybody believes that the progress is fast enough. Frankly, the numbers of diversity, when you look at diversity statistics in the C-suite, are in some cases equally as poor as what you would see in the boardroom, and oftentimes less diverse. So, we think and talk about that a lot at the board list. We have a lot of people that are using our platform, frankly, for executive searches. And so we certainly talk about how we can support, some of the change that we've been able to drive in the boardroom, bring that into the C-suite as well. So my personal opinion is that we have a long way to go, particularly in the executive suite. And that I would say is kind of the next horizon of work. The challenge with this, as you said, so many of these things are big, meaty, difficult problems. Right. And our philosophy from the beginning was, let's start with women. Let's start with gender diversity because we want to make progress somewhere, right? And let's move the needle and see what works and what doesn't work. And as soon as we had traction there, I said, okay, we can extend this more broadly, with under a broader definition of diversity. And now I think it's, okay, we have definitely, we're nowhere near done. There's a lot more work to be done in the boardroom, but we do have a model that we think can make impact beyond just the boardroom. And so how do we start thinking about what that looks like? So it is, to your point exactly, these are complex, very large problems. A lot of work needs to be done. And the question is, how do we sort of order that and make sure that we're not biting off more than we can chew, still making impact, but at the same time making as much impact as possible, as broadly as possible.
Well, kudos to you guys for continuing to find new ways to move the needle. These are all helpful and they're all important. Delighted to see about the success so far and the way that you've been sharing it with us. Clearly, we will link to the boardchallenge.org website so organizations can go there and be a part of this as well as just the board list. And it's great to see what you guys are doing. Do you have any thoughts about the next future opportunities that you might be bringing forward and ways to continue to advance these causes?
I think, what you can expect from the board list is, continued work on gender and racial diversity in particular, but also being quite thoughtful about broader questions of diversity and what a truly high-performing boardroom looks like, right? We're not in the business of diversity for diversity's sake. As Brad Kirshner of the Board Challenge often likes to say, this isn't a box-checking exercise. It is truly about driving board performance, and so being thoughtful about where we see best practices, trying to share those out as broadly as possible. So that's one thing certainly we're planning to do at the Board Challenge is, given the sort of caliber, quality, and quantity of CEOs that we have involved in the Board Challenge, how do we take their learnings, observe their journey as they bring more diversity to their boardroom, and share those learnings back out with a broader set of CEOs and beyond. The idea here is we're all learning and we're all growing and changing. And so the more that we can learn from each other, the better.
Well, that's great. Well, Shannon, it was wonderful to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights, the great work that you guys are doing and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Shannon Gordon. It's great to hear about how the board list came about and how it's been so successful and obviously the related board challenge. Both of these are very important organizations and opportunities, and excited to see they're making great progress. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to everything we talked about in today's episode. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land the board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. And thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.